The older you get, the more accurately you understand the differences between love and lust. As a young boy, I might have looked upon the woman I married with disgust, perhaps even revulsion. She was a mousy brunette, a far cry from the blonde bombshells I stumbled to impress in high school. But when I met my wife, I was in my mid-30s. I knew that the lustful boy I once was could never have understood the infection and admiration I felt for her. It was simply love. An ex-girlfriend who I had maintained a tepid friendship with after we broke up had invited me to her birthday party, and Elle was there, a wallflower in a sea of drunk revelers. We struck up a conversation and quickly found a whole slew of mutual interests, including books, movies, and even favorite ice cream flavors. I went home a little tipsy, with the resolve to call her the next morning, and so I did. Elle was a sweet and kind woman, filled with adoration for me that she rarely kept to herself. At first, it was quite cute. After our first few dates, she began to tell our mutual friends how much she liked me and how she saw a future with me. By the time we moved in together after a year of serious dating, she was the literal definition of smitten. If I stayed at home playing a video game or catching up on emails, she'd be right next to me in bed, reading a novel or watching TV. If I went out to the supermarket, she would insist on coming along and helping me with the groceries. It got to the point where I wouldn't even have been surprised if she had suggested riding a tandem bicycle everywhere we went. She was that attached. The only time we were apart was when we both had to work. Fast forward another year and a half, and we had firmly tucked 3 months of marriage under our belts. I had dismissed the warnings from my friends about the old ball and chain, disliking the misogyny inherent in that phrase. After all, I loved my wife, and I could never imagine her feeling like a burden. But it seemed as if marriage only heightened her infatuation. It began to feel unhealthy. She no longer insisted on accompanying me everywhere I went, but instead, which was somehow far worse, interrogated me at length every time I went out or came home. Who did you see? Where did you go? What did you talk about? The rosy glow of love quickly gave way to exasperation, and soon enough, I felt myself desperately craving an out. We had just marked our 1 year of marriage when the company I worked for decided to acquire a smaller company through a merger. Well, that meant the influx of 37 new employees. The team I worked on gained 6 new members, 5 of whom were utterly nondescript, an observation I mentioned to my fellow team member the first day they all started working. Wait till you see Angelica, he noted with a wink. He had been part of the steering committee that had decided to carry on through with the merger, and he had personally interviewed each incoming new member to our team. She's the last thing from nondescript. He sighed breathlessly. I was amused at his uncharacteristic behavior, but decided to hold out on forming any opinions about it until I met this Angelica. On the second day of the merger, I walked into an office with a decidedly changed atmosphere. The buzz of fresh blood had quickly abated, replaced by the dull sensation of another day, and the 5 new employees looked comfortably at home, furiously typing away on their keyboards. I looked around the office, but still no Angelica. Disappointed, I trudged over to my cubicle. To my surprise, a woman was already sitting in my seat. I cleared my throat, ready to tell her that she was in the wrong place. And when she turned her head to face me, and any coherent thoughts, words, sounds that I'd formed in my mind immediately slipped from my grasp. She was breathtaking, literally. I felt like I had the wind knocked out of me, and the young horny boy in me fumbled inside, prompting me to blurt out, "Excuse me, you're in my seat."
What?
She said, her voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head and leaned in quizzically. Her perfume wafted toward me in the tight space, and my breath hitched in my throat. She smelled amazing.
Is this your cubicle?
I nodded mutely, and she let out a tinkling laugh, shaking her head again. Her hair, a luscious auburn, fanned out behind her as she gathered her things and stood up.
I'm so sorry. I spent forever looking for my seat and decided to sit for a minute. Here. New shoes?
she said, sheepishly, gesturing at her heels. I barely managed to squeak out a no problem before she swept out of my way and into the open space between all the cubicles. I put my coffee down and powered up my computer as the woman paced back and forth. None of the new employees seemed to pay any attention to her pacing. I felt my heartbeat finally return to a normal place, and there she was, peering over the edge of my cubicle.
I'm sorry to bother you again. I'm Angelica. I just transferred here. I'm totally lost. Do you know where my cubicle might be?
She locked eyes with me, hers a heavenly shade of blue, and I felt my heart quicken again. I nodded.
Great.
She was smiling at me, and I felt my knees turn to jelly. I even grabbed the edge of the desk for support. Without a word, I motioned for her to follow me, and I surveyed the rest of the cubicles. I could still smell her perfume, and it was intoxicating, dizzying even, and her body. I had not felt a lust like that in years, certainly not for Elle. Damn it, I needed to pull it together. I closed my eyes, regaining composure, and then pointed at the cubicle in the far corner of the office. Pretty sure that's yours, I said with a voice that nearly betrayed my nervousness. Then I about-faced and headed back to my cubicle, hoping that Angelica would stay put. The end of the workday was a reprieve. At 6 p.m. sharp, I shot out of my seat and headed straight for the parking lot. I was making a beeline for my car when I heard my name.
Andrew.
I didn't turn. I knew it was Angelica. I couldn't be tempted again. I sped up and unlocked my car, turning on the engine and peeling out of there as fast as it would let me. The next few weeks were torture. Despite my best efforts to distance myself, Angelica found ways to talk to me. She would regale me in conversation in the lounge, laughing as she made her morning coffee while I stood, stony-faced. She would ask me questions and touch my arm gently, sending tingles down my spine. She would stand up and stretch at various intervals throughout the day, turning in my direction each time, and though I tried not to look, I couldn't help but sneak a peek at her lithe, slim body. She drove me crazy with lust. A month after I first met her, I somehow ended up taking the elevator with her down to the parking lot. The 5 seconds we were enclosed in that tight space felt like an eternity, as I fixated on the sound of my own ragged breathing. When the doors opened, I stepped forward, fully intending on marching my way to my car and ignoring her. Instead, she stood in my way, her chest heaving and her lip trembling.
Andrew.
I bit my lip and looked upward, but she grabbed my chin and pulled me down so I looked directly into her gorgeous eyes.
I want to fuck you so bad.
She whispered to me, leaning in to kiss me, and that was it. I couldn't fight it anymore. I pulled her close and kissed her back, relishing the heady rush of touching her. Her hands clung to my arms, her body melting into mine, and all I could think about was how good it felt to touch her, how badly I wanted her. Her mouth was hot and wet against mine, and I could feel her breathing, just as ragged as mine, echo into the minimal space between us.
Let's go home,
she murmured. And so began an affair that I knew was wrong, that I knew I shouldn't have given in to, but that I was utterly transfixed by. Elle easily swallowed my lies about having a huge project deadline for my late hours, but I felt racked with guilt every time I came home. I would look at her sleeping form in bed as I removed the clothes that Angelica had nearly ripped off my body a few hours before, and think of what a disservice I was doing to a woman who I loved, and who loved me so much. I'm telling you all of this so you do understand I feel guilty. I know I shouldn't have cheated. It was a mistake that I wish I could take back. It was a mistake that I wish I could erase. It's too late now. And if it means anything, I want you all to know that I messed up. I fucked up real bad. Because yesterday, Angelica didn't come into work. She didn't call our superior to let him know she was sick, so I went to her apartment after work to check in on her. I found her in bed, with her throat slit. Her body was cut open vertically and laid bare. her blood fanning out behind her into the sheets like a pair of macabre angel wings. Her face was frozen in utter terror, and each of her organs was displayed neatly at the foot of the bed, and a note laid in wait for me. I wanted to see if she was as beautiful on the inside.
I want you to kill her.
The voice echoed, low, monotonic, unwavering. In front of me was my mother, crucified haphazardly upon a ramshackle wooden cross. Rivets were driven through each palm, with rope and fastenings in place around her ankles and shoulders to keep her in position. Her eyes, red and cracked from exposure, pulled open by tape to reveal pupils dilated with fear. Her mouth was sewn shut, muffling her tired pleas.
This is hardly an existence.
The voice lit. I surveyed my surroundings. I was in a small, square room, with metal walls no larger than my studio apartment. The roof, however, was missing, replaced by an empty void that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness above. About 5 feet in front of me was my mother, writhing weakly against her restraints. 5 feet behind her, an impossibly tall ladder stretching into the abyss.
What are you waiting for? As if you care.
Who was talking? Where was this voice coming from? Its warm presence swaddled me like a warm blanket. In one swift surge, the gravity of the situation dawned on me. I didn't know where I was, and I didn't like being lost. I felt the kick of adrenaline into my bloodstream, my heart beating against my ribcage, my hands clammy. I clenched them repeatedly, open, closed, open, closed. I needed to get out of here.
End her.
My gaze dashed to my right-hand side to find a surgical stand stocked full of pain-inflicting paraphernalia. A knife, a rope, a pistol, razor blades, full needles, strange pills, and powder. An arsenal fit to maim, disfigure, and destroy. I reached for the razor blade. I couldn't cut the stitching on my mother's mouth, garner some insight into what the fuck was going on. My mother always knew what was going on. With the razor blade in hand, I walked gingerly up to my mother, whose eyes lit up as I approached. And through all the pain, tears, and stitches, as I drew closer, she smiled. I held up my left hand to coddle my mother's face, with the razor blade still pinched in my right. As she nuzzled her face into my palm, I cracked. I wept harder than I'd ever wept before. Full-bodied, racking sobs crashed over me. Because it didn't matter how bad anything got. It didn't matter how broken the situation, or how broken the person. My mother was just happy I was there. I steadied myself and lifted up my right hand, trembling as I drew closer to her face, ready to pick away at the stitches to the best of my ability. The first few snapped, then the next, until all the stitches had split and I liberated her mouth from its cage. I exhaled raggedly, leaning back to look deeply into my mother's eyes. Mum? But as tears fell down her cheeks, through her warm, loving smile, she uttered one word. Climb. I peered past her towards the ladder, then looked back towards her for reassurance. It took a slow, simple nod to realize that this was what I had to do. And as I walked slowly towards the ladder, she murmured one last thing. I love you. I love you too, Mom. I never said that enough. Then, with the razor blade still in hand, I climbed. I climbed with determination. I climbed for what seemed like hours. I climbed past broken rungs, and even when I was tired, I kept on climbing. I cried as I climbed, but I pushed through, with snot dribbling down my chin and tears clouding my vision. I reminisced as I climbed. I climbed through good memories, and I climbed through bad memories. I climbed through the time when I had the flu and my mother came around to do my laundry. I climbed through the time my girlfriend cheated on me. I climbed because I was so sick of this dark room. I climbed to make my mother proud. And as I climbed, the darkness subsided, opening itself up to light. I could see where the ladder ended now. I could see my way out. As I placed my hand on the last rung of the ladder and pulled myself up over the edge, I was overcome by brightness. The light subsided, and as I got my bearings, I found myself on my back, in my bathtub, still clutching the razor blade. Urgent knocking on my bathroom door roused me from my daze. "Are you alright in there? Your sister called. We're worried about you." It was my mother's voice. I got up out of the tub and placed the razor blade back on the shelf, walking towards the door. As I flung it open, she looked at me. She looked at me, and she knew. She held me in her arms and we sobbed. "I wouldn't know how to live without you," she whimpered. My climb had just begun. There he was, in the distance, standing in the middle of that old, trodden down backcountry path, with a smile of pure innocence etched on his face, as it always seemed to be. The rain smashing down on the ground below. His old yellow rain jacket, which his mother had bought him on his 3rd birthday, protected him from the storm's assault. The scent of the rain enveloped the air as if Poseidon's cold grasp wished to suffocate the life from the earth. His gaze never wavered from my eyes, his innocent smile permanent upon his cheeks.
Dad!
With one simple utterance, he drew back a lifetime of memories. There I was, standing in the middle of that park again, the sun splitting the earth and the skin on my cheeks. My eyes were locked on him, standing atop the slide with that ever-fixed smile etched across his face. Again, the sun lit up his eyes, turned his hair golden, made him appear almost like an angel would. Fitting. I saw her, fleetingly. Her hazel brown eyes studied mine for the briefest of moments, and then disappeared into eternity again. I smiled back at him. I tried to stop the tears from breaking free from their bondage and streaming down my old wrinkled face, but I couldn't. I tried to pretend this wasn't real, but I couldn't.
I want to come home.
Those were the words I waited an eternity to hear. "I want you to come home too," I uttered through a barrage of tears that now drowned my scorched old skin. Home isn't real anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. He looked confused, and imagined he would. He didn't really know where he was. He didn't really know me. "I'm sorry." I struggled to get those words out, those words of infinite importance. "I'm so sorry." I knew, even as I spoke them, my words were futile, null and void, spoken upon deaf ears. Yet, I still had to hear them out loud, had to listen to them echo amongst the thicket and disappear into perpetuity.
It's okay, Dad. I forgive you.
He was shaking, not frantically, but obviously. They were struggling with human interaction, as they always did.
Can we go home now?
If only he knew how much I wanted to grant his request, how much I wanted to hold him in my arms and never let go. If only he knew how much I regretted that day, how much I missed him. "I can't take you home." I told him what he already knew.
Why, Dad?
Because I told you, home isn't real anymore. You aren't real anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see him, sitting there on that old wooden bench in Paris all alone. It's just beyond dusk. The tall, dark lindens lurk behind like a hungry pack of wolves. There isn't a smile on his face anymore. There's just sadness in his eyes, Hidden behind that sadness is betrayal. There's an anger in those eyes. It's hard to see, but like a satellite floating amongst the stars in the night sky, once you notice it, it's impossible to overlook. That anger, that raging fire which he truly doesn't understand, is directed toward me and her. I imagine he sat there for hours just waiting for his mom and dad to come back and save him from the demons of the night. He was too young to lose hope, too naive. Mom and dad would never arrive. They were facing their own demons in a hotel room on the other side of Paris. Their demons haunted them from the end of a syringe. I see myself that night, lying lifeless on a hotel room floor. There's nothing in my eyes. No hurt, no pain, just nothing. Her eyes are closed. The pale light of the damp hotel room made us appear as almost ghosts would. Fitting. I should have been there. I whispered the truth that was far from a revelation. You should be here, not me. If it wasn't for me, you both would be here. I've never forgiven myself for it. I can't. She couldn't forgive herself either, despite the countless hours of therapy and getting clean for the first time in 6 years. It's why when I found her, lifeless in that bathtub, surrounded in her own blood, I didn't bother to ask myself, or God, or anyone for that matter, why. The rain's assault on this ancient Wisconsin woodland still terrorized the evening sky. On the other side of the world, from Paris, where my boy had disappeared that night, he stood there, right in front of me. It wasn't hard to tell it wasn't real. It had been 25 years since that day, yet he hadn't aged a minute. It should have terrified me. It should have made me want to run for my life. But I'd heard about at least a dozen times before, the people of the forest, or mimics, people would call them. There wasn't any explanation as to why they do it. Perhaps it's to enable us to confront our own demons. Catharsis through screaming at impersonations of what we lost. Closure, even if it isn't real. My boy died that night, 25 years ago, cold and alone, hidden in the shadow of the Parisian skyline. It wasn't his fault, of course. He was 6 years old when his parents forgot him in a city park in Paris. They were too infatuated with escaping this reality through the end of a syringe than caring for a child. Consequently, every day for the past 25 years, I've considered escaping reality through the end of a syringe one more time, though this time for good. It had felt like I'd been standing there forever, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. A final, forlorn tear rolled down my cheek as I finally gathered enough courage to take a few steps toward him. I kept my eyes on the ground beneath my feet, my mind infatuated with the raindrops meeting the earth in a transparent explosion over and over again. Finally, I gathered enough strength to lift my gaze from the dirt to meet his eyes. There was nothing in his eyes. Emptiness. I knew I had to go. Goodbye, my beautiful boy. It's what I'd wanted forever. It didn't seem like enough, and it never would. The farewell I'd never imagined I'd get to say. They'd given it to me for a reason I'll truly never understand. I didn't want to turn my back on him. Not again. But it wasn't really him, and I couldn't go on pretending it was. One final time, I turned my back on him to part ways forever. And as soon as I turned my head around to find him again, standing there smiling through the rainfall, he'd gone. Ad infinitum.